Hey, Mikey here, doing my presentation on deconstruction. Deconstruction is the approach that tries to explain the relationship between text and that text meaning. In other words, what the author is trying to put across through their literature and how their literature could be viewed differently with different people viewing it and stuff like that. I guess deconstruction focuses on the ambiguity between like what a piece of work is saying, but versus how that piece of work is actually coming across. And I think deconstructionism does a good job in bringing people together to criticize literature and discuss how literature can be viewed differently depending on who's viewing it. Okay, deconstruction was pioneered by a man named Jacques Derrida or Derrida. I'm not too sure on how his name's pronounced, but one quote that I found interesting when viewing some of his work was, "No writing is completely cohesive and in agreement with itself." And that's interesting because different people will view if they're looking at a piece of literature, they would view that maybe in a different way than another person, depending on the time they're alive and depending on who's viewing it. So yeah, another person who was a prominent figure and who brought deconstruction more to the world was a lady named Helene Siviu. I'm not too sure on these names, but she was a French feminist. She was a poet and she was a philosopher and literary critic who was influenced by Jacques Derrida and what deconstruction was actually talking about. Where and she would use deconstruction. She would try to put out pieces of literature that would get people thinking in different ways by saying one thing and maybe sparking different avenues of thought when it came to her piece of writing. One of her most famous and well-renowned pieces of literature was the Laugh of Medusa, which established her as a prominent figure whilst using deconstruction, and later established her as one of the early thinkers in post-structural feminism, which seemed to be quite important. So she was also, I believe, reading she was influenced as well by Sigmund Freud. So that's also interesting. The third figure who used deconstruction in their work was a guy named Michael Foucault. I'm not too sure on his names, but he was a philosopher and literary theorist who addressed the relationship between power and knowledge. So he used deconstruction in his work and stuff like that. He brought out many works on the study of literary theory, sociology, and critical theory. So yeah, that goes back to like being influenced by Jacques Derrida and how he used deconstructionism to in his work and made him a prolific figure at the time. Examples of his work include The Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, and the history of madness, which is those are some of his works. I thought was interesting. So deconstruction, I think, goes back to the noticing the ambiguity that goes into viewing different works and how they can be interpreted in a different way depending on who's reading it. It goes deep. What I think of deconstruction in today's era is the stuff to do with texting and emails, because we're starting to live in a world where it's less face to face and it's more typing messages. I think there's a lot of ambiguity that goes with how texts are perceived. Like one person might write a text and intend for it to mean one thing, whereas the person reading the text could interpret it as something else. And I think that's what deconstruction, the types of thing that deconstruction goes into. I think thinking like this also creates a situation where nothing can be interpreted as like a solid truth or undeniable truth. Everything's questioned, and so the text can be picked apart and read in a number of varying ways. And that's how deconstruction basically gets its name. It's like deconstructing the sentence and looking at how it can be interpreted in different ways. And I think that's what it homes in on. And it all depends on who's reading it and the time frame in which it's being read as well. Because so say something in the Victorian times may be viewed differently by someone who's reading it in today's era, if that makes sense. Deconstruction is basically noticing the ambiguity that goes with text and how looking for the meaning can be hard, but it's basically focusing on that, the ambiguity of text.